Terrorism in the broadest definition is any act that targets civilians rather than military, although some terrorist acts do target military, but generally it's conceded to be targeting of civilians and non-combatants with the purpose of defeating a society. And there's a great deal of state violence against people that they are considered enemies of the state that could be considered and should be considered terrorism. However, the states define terrorism as acts of either asymmetrical warfare, where a less armed and capable group is trying to have some influence, might even be self-defensive, and using terrorist tactics in order to dissuade. I think the human community avoids violence as much as possible because of our memory of violence. And when you choose violence, you're not only harming the person you're choosing as the enemy, you're harming yourself. And I think the human community knows that lesson. So people will put up with a great deal of abuse before they go to violence. So many things are called terrorism, and many terrorist acts are exempted. However, if people get to a point of despair or hopelessness, and they feel that there's no other way out and all other options have been tried, then a small segment of them will win by arguing for violence, and for a period they'll get sanctuary and sanction and support out of the larger group for the violence. But once you restore justice and restore hope, then those people are no longer given that sanction and support. And that's really the only way out of the cycle, to respond to terrorism with counterterrorism and violence. In the end, only creates more victims and more anger.
So terrorism is one of these concepts, one of these terms that's obviously very important at the moment to elites in the West. That with the Cold War being over, it's pretty much consensus that this has got to be the thing that's going to replace it, the war on terror, global war on terror, blah, blah, blah. And so you have to define terrorism obviously very carefully. It has to be something that only they do, and that we don't do, and that takes some pretty fancy footwork. The way the term is generally used is something like shock and awe. When it's carried out by non-state, low-tech groups. So, in other words, elites in the West would prefer that terrorism be something done generally by non-state groups, though it can be backed by terror states, it can be backed by enemy states. But generally, they want to avoid the idea of terrorism being attached to states. Even in the axis of evil, I think as a whole they would prefer that these evil states sponsor terrorism. The notion that states can inherently be terroristic and use terroristic methods is kind of dangerous, because then it might come back to haunt us. So generally non-state, generally low-tech. And blowing yourself up in the marketplace and so on is pretty low-tech too. I said it was a form of shock and awe. What I meant by that is that when we use the word terrorism, we generally refer to an act of extreme violence, which is meant to shock. It's not as if it shocks accidentally. It's meant to shock. It's meant to create awe and, of course, fear, terror, extreme fear, and therefore to intimidate populations.
The bombers took off from the Hornet in the early morning of the 18th of April, 1942. They were about to fly into history. But first they set course for the Japanese mainland. The bombing of Tokyo dealt a huge psychological blow to the Japanese. And the man who had masterminded and led the raid was the then Colonel Jimmy Doolittle.
In 1954, World War II General Jimmy Doolittle sent a secret report to President Eisenhower. Speaking of the Cold War, he stated, "Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. if the United States is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy.